Hi everyone! Today we're going to dive into a few unsettling, powerful, really eye-opening books that might feel a little bit too close to reality right now, but they're definitely relevant today. If you may be looking for a start into reading dystopian books, and especially feminist dystopia, I have some recommendations for you that you might want to curl up with, or you might want to scream a little bit when you're reading them. At least that's what they made me feel, personally. I mean, let's be real, we're all feeling a little bit anxious right now, right? And I know a lot of us are worried about what the future might hold, especially when it comes to women's rights, autonomy and equality. And it is so wild to think that these fictional worlds are not that far from what some people might be experiencing right now in other parts of the world, and what's also on our minds on what might happen in the future. But because of that, I think it's even more important that we start reading these books, that we keep talking about it. And that's why today I'm going to talk you through 3 books that tackle the idea of control and freedom and what it means to survive in a world like this, and maybe even fight back in societies that want to take that away. Alright, first up we have The Grace Year by Kim Liggett. And if you haven't heard of this one yet, you're in for a wild ride. This book is set in this ultra-conservative, super patriarchal society that lets women, or in this case girls, believe that they are basically dangerous because of this magic that they possess. And of course that magic is actually code for everything that has to do with womanhood, with sexuality, their strength, their potential, just everything that this society thinks could disrupt it and disrupt the social order. So when these girls hit 16, they are being sent away to this secluded island for a year. And this year is called the Grace Year. And during this time they are expected to rid themselves of this magic that they possess and will also survive because the conditions aren't that great. And let's be clear, this society doesn't care if these girls even make it back or not. They are just thrown into this brutal, primitive environment and are expected to just deal with it and try to survive there. And by that I mean survive not only against the harsh conditions and the outside world, but also survive against each other. Because it's almost a little bit like a Lord of the Flies scenario. It's actually really intense. And that's actually what I also love about the Grace Year, that it's not only about this big bad world they're fighting against, but they're also fighting against each other. And the dynamic between the girls is really interesting, because this really builds the tension in the book of this competition that is going on between them, the suspicion, and it really keeps you on the edge the whole time throughout the book. And there really are these moments where you just ache, because basically you feel like these girls have to turn against each other at some point. And that's because of the situation that they're being put in. It's almost like society has really wired them to distrust each other and to pit them against each other. But this book isn't just fighting and competition and bad things happening, but there's also hope in there too, because Tierney, the main character, she is really fierce and she really believes in fighting against the system. She's really independent and she sees the flaws in the system and she is not broken by it. She's someone that you can root for throughout the whole book, and you can really, through her journey, start to question the society that they're in. And with her you start to ask these questions of, why are we as a society so afraid of girls and women and their power? And what could actually happen if, instead of fighting against each other, we would come together and find a way to join the forces against a real enemy. Moving right along to Vox by Christina Dalcher. Now, Vox is really a hard-hitting book. It is set in the US that has fallen under an extreme control, where women are not allowed to speak any more than 100 words per day. And just let that sink in. 100 words. That is not a lot. That's maybe like a sentence or two before in this world you're shocked by a bracelet if you try to speak too much. In our world and in this world, language is power, and women are being stripped of both. Girls aren't taught to write or speak anymore, and because of that, any ambition, any career that women or girls might have had is basically being erased there. And the story follows Jean, a scientist who is grappling with this sudden horrific change in her life and dealing with that while also trying to raise her daughter. And she's living in this family dynamic, which is also really interesting because you see her relationship with her husband change, and because of the way that he's not necessarily being one of the really bad guys, but also exploring themes of what does it mean to be passive in a world where rights are being taken away and where you're part of the privileged group, and how that affects people in your life and people of marginalized groups that you're not a part of, but you're just being passive and watching all of that happen and maybe agreeing with what's happening because you're not in that position, because you're in a position of privilege. And what's really interesting in this as well is that there's this sense of urgency in here, because Jean is not only fighting for herself but also for future generations, and as a scientist she feels like she really has a responsibility, and like she has to do this right now because future generations might not have the chance to do it then, because they will not have a voice anymore, they won't have any power anymore, they don't even know what it feels like to have power. And she still has that. And she really is a fighter's spirit, and you can feel that throughout the book. And it's really interesting because it also explores how these rules can be bent if you need something from a woman in this instance, and how that can then be used, and how you will maybe get some privileges back if they want something from you, and if they need you, and they realize that in a society like this. And also what it means to fight for even the simplest of rights. And what really makes this book so chilling is how plausible it feels, how you can really see the gradual shift, and I think it's really explained very well how it happened in the society that all of these rules were being enforced very quickly, and how easily rights can be taken away if people in power decide to do that. And when I was reading this, I was like, how far off is this really? And with the current political climate, I have to say, probably not that far off. And that is really scary. This book really taps into all of the fears that we are having about censorship, about control and rights being taken away, and how certain voices might be silenced. And of course, this doesn't just apply to women's rights, this also applies to all other marginalized groups. And even though while you're reading it you might think, oh, this is maybe a bit over the top, or this couldn't happen to us, it is a cautionary tale, and it really explores also the subtle ways in which people are being manipulated, and how emotional manipulation can also play a role in enforcing rules like this. And of course, this book also really explores what communication and words and language mean to us and what power lies in them. And it's not just about words, it's about our whole humanity, really. And as Jean fights back, you feel every bit of her frustration, of her anger and her power, also her desperation and her hope. And at first, while I was reading this, I didn't like it that much because of some things in the writing style, and there were just some things about the story and the plotline that I was like, maybe it could have been done better. But since then I've really thought about this book a lot actually, and especially in the past few weeks I feel like I've started coming back to these books, and I think that's much more important than some plot points, that books leave you wondering and thinking, and yeah, in this case really thinking about how we would react, or how I would react if somebody would try to take my rights away. Because it's always easy to think that you would react differently and that you would maybe fight against it and stand up and be fierce. But in reality, I don't know if I would or if I could. And these are some scary thoughts, but really important thoughts to have, to just be prepared and also notice the subtle ways in which our rights can be affected, even if we might not even realize it at first. And of course, no feminist dystopian discussion would be complete without this book, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I mean, this is really the OG feminist dystopia, right? It is set in the city of Gilead, where fertility has become a price-controlled resource, and women are really reduced to their reproductive capabilities. And this world is really dark and brutal and completely disturbing, but it is so well written that you really can't look away. And unfortunately, we can still see parallels to our society right now. This story follows Offred, a handmaid forced into bearing children of powerful men, while at the same time having her name and her identity being stripped away, as well as all of her personal agency. And Margaret Atwood really has a great writing style that really captures this sparse and eerie feeling and the sense of repression and survival. And kind of like invokes in this book, the inner monologue of the protagonist is also really important. It basically becomes this tool for resistance and shows how even in dark, very dark circumstances, people can find ways to reclaim parts of themselves. And in this world, there isn't even a question anymore about bodily autonomy and about reproductive rights. And that is really scary. And for me, that threat might not be as near as to some of the people living in the US or in different countries. But it's still very real, and it still affects me to hear about it and to read about it as well. Because if you really think about this, the time that we've had these rights really hasn't been that long in the first place. And it doesn't even have to be rights that are being taken away, but it also is society and pressure and religion and all of these things that play into this in this book as well. And reading The Handmaid's Tale now, after all that has been happening, really makes this hit on a visceral level. There's just a sense of foreboding and vulnerability that really makes you question which rights do we have right now that could just be taken away, and also about societal norms and the pressure that comes with reproductive rights. And even if you don't live in a society like this one, it can just be the same thing but on a much smaller scale and on like a much more subconscious level. So it really just is a stark reminder why we have to keep fighting for equality and autonomy as well. And apart from the obvious topics in this book, this is really a story about how even if you feel like you're powerless, you can still find ways to hold on to who you are. It's a story about connection in very small gestures and meaningful ways to communicate if you don't have a chance to do it freely anymore, and about sisterhood as well, and about support and what that means if you're in a position of being powerless. And this book really just is a survival guide for the spirit. It really touched me deeply, and I can just really recommend this. So there you have it, 3 feminist dystopian books that might make you feel a little bit scared and also probably very angry. At least that's what I felt when I was reading them. But hopefully also a lot more inspired, because that's really the thing about dystopian fiction. Yes, it is about worst case scenarios. Of course, that's how dystopias work, but it also teaches you a lot about resilience, resistance, and the power of holding on to what we believe in and what we stand for and who we are as people. And that is just so important in times like these, to not forget your values, who you are, what you stand for, and also being loud. And I really want you all to know that while times might feel uncertain, there is power in staying informed, there's power in knowledge, and in keeping stories like these alive. And each of these books has a story for someone who might feel like they had to fight for their voice, they have to fight for their freedom or their identity. So let's keep reading, let's keep talking about these things, let's keep fighting for a future where stories like these hopefully just have to stay in the fictional realm. And I know that this might be a very dark topic, and I know a lot of you are affected by it, and so am I. And I just hope that what you take away from this really is that there's power in connection, there's power in unity, there's so much that is being said, there are so many people who believe in the right things. But we have to keep having these conversations for it to stay relevant. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Please let me know if you have read any of these, and if you have any more recommendations for more feminist dystopian books or just books about feminism in general, because I really also want to broaden my horizons in that field. I want to keep reading different positions, different perspectives on that, because I know there's a lot more that has to be said and has to be heard as well, besides from what I've just showed you, because these are as well very white and Western-centric stories. Just because of what's been going on recently, I've decided to pick these. But of course, there's many more stories and many more levels to this. And also, if you want to just talk about how you've been feeling and what you've been experiencing in the past few weeks, please feel free to do so in the comments and message me. Take care, stay safe, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!